Hello again, and it's time for more key questions. This time, Chapter 31. Number 1. Describe how Harding and Coolidge were pro-business compared to Progressive-era presidents. Well, first of all, Harding was the first, I guess you could say, Republican president, pro-business president since the Progressive era started. Roosevelt and Wilson were both very much about limiting the power of business to benefit its consumers. Harding, meanwhile, was a very weak leader who said yes to everything the Republicans asked him to do. With the Republicans being a party which favored big business, they pushed Harding to accept high tariffs and even pushed him to allow a lot of corruption. Coolidge himself, after Harding passes away, Coolidge himself was a very laissez-faire president, and he favored big business and cutting taxes. This brings us to Andrew Mellon's idea of trickle-down economics, which means cutting taxes on the rich, believing that cutting taxes on them would lead to greater job growth as the money trickled down into the lower ranks of our society. With that said, Coolidge also blocks the passage of a law that would have benefited farmers and given them some relief from the struggles of the time. So both these presidents favor big business. They don't rein in trusts and instead allow businessmen to run the government and do as they please to make money. Number 2, why was Harding's administration filled with corruption? And give a couple specific examples. Harding, as I mentioned, was a very weak president who was brought in just because they knew that they could push him around. After having 20 years of progressive leaders like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson at the helm of the presidency, they decided that it was time to have someone who would just go along with it. So Harding was taken advantage of. Many of the men from his Ohio gang, the state where he was from, came with him to the White House and filled his administration. Now, for specific examples, you have Harry Doherty, you have Forbes. Those men took money from veterans' hospitals, or they simply allowed prohibition to be ignored and handed out licenses to help people get around it. But the most famous example is Teapot Dome. In this case, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was willing to allow the oil reserves around Teapot Dome to be leased out to private companies, meaning they would make money off of federal territory and federal resources. Meanwhile, Albert Fall was receiving money, and he becomes one of our first cabinet members to actually go to jail for his crimes of corruption. Number 3, explain the development of American isolationism. So when World War I ends, America has been involved in imperialism for the last 30 years. We've gone through big stick diplomacy. We've gone through dollar diplomacy and Wilson's moral diplomacy. We get involved in a war we really kind of look back and doubt whether we should have been in. We talked last chapter about the lost generation of writers. I haven't even mentioned the Nye Committee, which claimed that the only reason we entered the war was for weapons manufacturers to make money off the war effort and to sell guns to European nations. So American isolationism develops in a few different ways. And the primary way is that we pass laws with other nations that allow us to withdraw, believing that world peace would be intact without us. That includes the Washington Conference, where we bring in powerful countries. At the Washington Disarmament Conference, what we decide is that we're all going to limit our navies. We have the Five Powers Treaty, which allowed the 5 largest navies in the world to promise to keep a ratio of 5 to 3 to 1, with America and Britain having the largest navies. Unfortunately for America, we were the only country to really follow through on that promise, with Japan itself violating the treaty and massively increasing their navy over the next few years. Next, we have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and like the Washington Conference and the Five Powers Treaty, it is an agreement amongst many nations. In this case, we actually make war illegal, as if people promising not to go to war would actually stop it from happening. So what you see in the first steps of American isolationism is our attempt to withdraw from world events and withdraw ourselves, but we try to solidify peace by making those agreements beforehand. We also have the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff passed in Hoover's presidency. That also built economic isolation. So as we raise tariffs, that means that we don't have to worry about trading with other countries, and we're more concerned with protecting our own manufacturing businesses through those tariff walls being built. So we have both intentional diplomatic isolation, and then we also have economic isolation. One last thing to touch on, however, is that we weren't fully withdrawn during the 1920s. That has to do with imperialism. Under both Harding and Coolidge, we have continued involvement and intervention in Central and Latin American countries. Specifically, we have troops in Haiti and Nicaragua. Finally, or not finally, rather just the fourth question. Sorry, not done. Number 4, what was the purpose of the Dawes Plan? Once again, kind of going along with number 3 about isolationism. In order to keep the world safe, we develop a plan to give out loans to Germany to help them survive the massive reparations required of them by the Treaty of Versailles. Had it not been for American money, the fledgling Weimar Republic of the German people, their new democracy as put in by the treaty, it would not have been able to survive because the $32 billion that they owed France and Britain was pulling pretty much all the money out of their economy and their government. So America loans them money. Now the sad part of the Dawes Plan is that money goes to Britain and France, who in turn owe us billions of dollars, and so they pay us back. So once our economy falters and eventually crashes starting in 1929 through the early 1930s, once our economy crashes, the Dawes Plan unravels, Germany can't stay afloat, and Britain and France collapse. So the Dawes Plan was meant to keep Germany afloat and keep war from happening, but unfortunately with our own economic collapse, it fails to do so. Number 5, what are the major causes of the Great Depression? Now, I mentioned that there are so many variables that play into this. So let's go over the main ones. Again, overproduction, number 1, overproduction by business and manufacturers, making way too many products that people had no chance of buying all of them. And by making all those products, they waste resources, they waste investments, they waste man hours and paying their workers to work. They end up having to buy warehouses to store these extra products that aren't selling, all the while lying to investors on the stock market about the fact that they were actually still making profits. So this overproduction, this belief that they would continue selling products was one of the first major mistakes. Second, overconsumption. Americans had no idea that a crash was coming, and so they continued to buy these mass-produced items. And because they were buying all these items that they couldn't necessarily afford, they bought all these items on credit. So when the economic crash happens and they begin losing their jobs, they still owe massive amounts of money that they have no ability to pay off. And so they collapse. Following this, you have the banking collapse. So overproduction, overconsumption, and then the banking collapse. Why did banks collapse? Well, they also invest in the stock market. Only sadly, they used American people's savings and checking accounts to also invest. They believed that, like businesses, the economy would continue to climb forever and they would easily make money off of it. So when businesses finally collapse and their stocks collapse, then people can't pay their debts back to the bank. Banks also collapse. Not to mention the bank runs that I mentioned in most classes, that people went to the banks to demand their money back once they heard that other banks were faltering. This caused a widespread collapse of the banking industry, with 28 states actually being without a single bank within its borders. So those are the main 3 causes. You can look at the outline if you'd like and look at things like the tariff war, look at the droughts, and many other causes that are in there. But those are the 3 major ones. Number 6, how did Hoover look to solve the Great Depression? As I've outlined in class, Hoover himself believed that the government shouldn't get involved. So at first, he continues laissez-faire and refuses to do anything to solve the Great Depression. In his mind, we as individuals, through rugged individualism, would lift ourselves up of the Great Depression. Once public pressure picked up, however, he was forced to make a couple changes. So he spends about $2.25 billion on first creating public works projects. Public works are where people go to work building something for the government using government funds. So it creates jobs while also providing a service. They could build roads, they could build bridges. In this case, they specifically build the Hoover Dam. So while that benefits society, it also creates jobs. He also gives loans to businesses through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He gives out loans to big businesses, again continuing the idea of trickle-down economics, that if big businesses survive and begin growing, that money will trickle down in the creation of more jobs. Those people will then have money to spend on the economy. Their spending will create more business growth, which will in turn create more jobs, and thus the economic cycle will continue. Now, unfortunately for Hoover, the example I gave you in class, he did not spend enough to make a difference. Which brings us to number 7. What mistakes did Hoover make in handling the Great Depression? Well, first, Hoover waited quite a while to react. And again, there was no precedent for presidents to get active and to try to change things. So Hoover decided to kind of let it sit. Beyond that, he also claimed that rugged individualism would lift us out, that people simply needed to work harder. Unfortunately, it's difficult to work harder when there are simply no jobs to work in. As you'll recall, 25% of Americans had no jobs. They were unemployed. And it's not like a quarter of our country's working force was just simply sitting at home lazily, not wanting to do anything. And so his blame by placing the blame on Americans, he causes a lot of people to be upset. And then you think about the action he takes. While he did create some jobs and he did provide some loans to businesses, it was simply not enough to overcome the struggles. So without taking much action, without with kind of blaming Americans for it, that leads people to naming things like Hoovervilles after him, also naming Hoover blankets, naming Hoover wagons, all those things to mock Hoover, blaming him for it. And the final mistake is the bonus army. Thousands of veterans come into Washington, D.C. to ask for their bonus. When they are turned away, this quote-unquote bonus army refuses to leave, and they stay there creating their own Hooverville and shantytown around D.C. Hoover unfortunately chooses the young Douglas MacArthur to usher them out. Unfortunately, he uses massive amounts of violence, and that violence causes people to think that Hoover is not only out of touch with the American people, but is now even treating their veterans horrifically. So that brings us to number 8. How did Hoover change U.S. foreign policy? Simply, he decided to treat the Caribbean and Latin American nations with kindness and respect. He called it the good neighbor policy. Basically, we withdrew our troops from Haiti and Nicaragua, stopped manipulating and controlling their economic systems in those nations, and overall just had a much friendlier relationship with them. So Hoover, while he kept us isolated from European and Asian events, he continued our involvement with Latin and Caribbean Americans. However, it was in a much nicer manner, and that's why it's called the good neighbor policy. All right, well, that does it for Chapter 31 questions. There's plenty more details in the chapter that we could talk about, but this covers the main ones that you need to remember. That's it. Have a good night, and if you have any questions, ask me later.